Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we're talking with Agrii's Tom Land, National Fertiliser Manager, and John Charlton, Crop Input Specialist in the North East. Today we're going to focus on phosphate across various crops, from cereals to maize, and why getting the balance right is so important for your crop as well as your farm business profitability. So Tom, perhaps I can start with your good self, and welcome back to Tramlines. Tom, what's the current trend in phosphate use on farm?
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I suppose we're identifying that growers are thinking very carefully about their inputs, often driven through price and economics, and certainly when we look at statistics in terms of the fertiliser use, fertiliser purchasing statistics in the UK, we can start to see that phosphate use is declining. Now that can be a good thing and also can be a bad thing if we're not addressing phosphate in the right places. Certainly to think about is, maybe certain things like precision farming, more use of organic manures are helping that situation, and actually overuse of phosphate isn't good for the environment either. So if the statistics are showing that growers are getting the best out of phosphate, then that's good. But I certainly start to see that data is suggesting that grain P concentrations are declining. So with that decline in use of P and decline in grain P, are we really paying attention to the finer details? Maybe. Yeah,
and John, that grain P, the phosphate that will be in the samples of grain that we test, what's the impact of that declining? Why should growers take note of that trend?
So thanks, Tony. Grain P is an indication of what the crop's off taking. So it's a retrospective look at if the crop nutrient management plan has been effective or not. So if we're seeing reduced P in grain, we are likely seeing reduced P availability to the crop throughout the growing year, which will have knock-on effects with principally rooting and energy transfer in the crop. So it will have a yield penalty potentially.
And so what could that yield penalty look like if we don't get these phosphate levels right?
Yeah, well, so phosphate dictates rooting, which dictates everything thereafter. So we've seen up to a tonne a hectare in places.
And Tom, as John has alluded to, that's quite a significant possible yield loss. So what can a grower do to mitigate that risk, to ensure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, I think the basics, understanding your soil limitations. So the index system, if you're on a P index 1 soil, you might get away and not see any reduction in yield, but actually the other factors, i.e. how deep is your soil, how much root system have you got in the soil, what the soil organic matter is, how well that crop was established, what other situations have gone on infecting the soil structure, the soil biology, may all, if the wind's really going in the wrong direction, then that's when you could see that significant yield reduction. And I think the cliff face gets a lot sharper the further you move down the index system if you haven't got the other factors in place, really.
And John, just coming back to you, I know you've done a lot of work in maize and other crops, but this is a principle we should carry across various crops, shouldn't we?
Yeah, it's any crop that's got a significant period of rooting requires a significant amount of energy, which is what phosphate drives energy flow in the crop. So anytime from sowing onwards, depending if it's a winter or a spring crop, phosphate availability is key to maximising output.
And what about other crops?
So, as one example, maize is particularly sensitive to phosphate in its early growth, and I've done taken some pictures and done some work to look at principle of using a product to improve phosphate availability at sowing, and there's some stark differences to be seen in that early growth, and that's what makes it for the whole year. Any spring sown crop is under that pressure to get going from the get go.
And currently, what are the key sources of phosphate on farm, Tom?
Well, you've got your traditional fertilizers, which are your TSP, your DAP based fertilizers. But actually, if we look at fertilizer usage maybe over the last 4 years, a lot of growers have been switching to using more organic manures, and that could range from anything from an ash-based source of P, like a material that derives from electricity production, so an ash material, right the way through to your good old-fashioned farmyard manure, through to sewage cake, etc. All products that contain various different sources of P within them.
And before we came on air, so to speak, Tom, you were talking about the cost of phosphate, its price, and the impact that has on whether a farmer chooses to apply it or not. Talk us through some of those trends and what is happening with the price of phosphate.
Unfortunately, very much up and not down. So that it's really challenging for the grower to think, well, where do I make the investment, or where do I make the saving on that spend? So obviously, if a grower can get hold of organic materials at a relatively low cost, or the cost of the replacement of that fertilizer, then absolutely that's the right thing to do, because the organic material is going to bring a whole host of other benefits, like improving soil biology, soil organic matter, etc. So that's a real positive. But a grower making the decision, do I buy a phosphate fertilizer or not? And sometimes a grower may put phosphate on and not actually see a yield response. So they then say, well, I didn't see a yield response, I won't buy it. But then at the same time, we see the dropping in the index system, or the dropping in the grain P. So I think growers have become more conscious of where they see the better return on investment for their spend, because obviously margins are challenged on farm, and growers need to prioritize what they're doing. But there are certain things they need to think about when making those decisions, really.
Yeah. And so in terms of those decisions, Tom, that you so wisely talk about, John, where do you advise farmers and growers to start in terms of checking where are they at with their phosphate levels, and when?
Yeah, so principally it's soil analysis to start off with. You need to know what you're working with from the start. That's usually tested at some time through the autumn or into the spring, well ahead of harvest time. And then after that, potentially, if you've got an import coming to the farm, organic manure, there's opportunity to test that and know exactly what you're dealing with, and then work a plan out from there, and then top off whatever's needed with conventional fertilizer or another source. But there's a range of sources of phosphate for all situation and cost, really.
And Tom, you've spoken about nutrient management plans in the past. Is this where they can be a really important?
Yeah, you can use the nutrient management plan and the time with the grower to talk about not just how much P they need to apply, but how you could maybe get the most out of that P you're thinking of applying. And like John said, using the soil analysis, a lot of growers are testing for things like much more than just how much P and K is in the soil. So using things like the pH, the organic matter that you might be seeing on soil testing, you can use those all to try and help understand where you might see a better response, or where you might not see so much of a response as well.
In terms of looking ahead or looking at current, best practice, I know Agrii, you've been doing a lot of R&D at Agrii and across the board, but John, what have you been looking at Agrii over the last few years?
So obviously fertilizers are continually developing world, and the economics are part of that as well. Placement of fertilizers has been a growing tool growers have been using, trying to get more out of what they apply. I mean, that principle counts in all fertilizer sources. It's nutrient use efficiency overall that we're looking for. So, and then on the economic side, it's using cheaper sources of phosphate that aren't necessarily available, like ash type products, and then working with growers that have got organic manures. If they're on the farm already, they're going to get used. Better placement, better use, and better application technology all benefit that outcome of product.
Unlock phosphate and other vital nutrients in your soil with Agrii Start Release. For detailed trial results across various crops, usage recommendations and tank mix compatibility, visit the Agrii Start release page on the Agrii website. Linked. Tom, tell us about Agrii Start Release, a product that I know you've had in your Agrii R&D trials, and what's the benefit to the grower?
Yeah, we've been trialing over numerous years various different sources of phosphate fertilizers, and we started life coating traditional phosphate fertilizers like TSP, DAP with products that work to increase the solubility, so give you a better increase of P, enabling you to maybe reduce the amount of P you applied with the fertilizer. So we did a lot of work with fertilizer coatings, and actually, those coatings exist in the market and growers are buying them and using them. But the active ingredient we were using, we started to see responses in the absence of phosphate being on the fertilizer. So to give you an example, if we used it on a K-based fertilizer or a fertilizer with no P in, we saw a lift in P. So we started off trialing the active ingredient in the absence of any phosphate fertilizer. And then when we started to pick the product apart, we started to understand, well, this is why it's increasing P availability. It is working on the fertilizer P, but also it's influencing the P that exists in the soil. Now, the P exists in various different forms. And actually what it was doing was increasing the availability of soluble P that the plant takes up in the form of orthophosphates and actually utilizes to produce root system, grow and live quite happily. So that's where we got to. And at that time, the market wasn't really ready for this type of product, but growers who were on high index soils where there's no justification for applying fresh phosphate, who had issues with P lockup in terms of reduced yield, signs of phosphate deficiency, maybe caused by elements such as high calcium levels in the soil. We saw an acceptance in the market. Farmers were buying it, using it, seeing yield responses, and everything was moving along quite happily. But fast forward maybe 18 months when phosphate prices went to £600 a tonne, we suddenly saw the market starting to adopt and use the release product that we have in the market across a wider crop area and a wider soil type area and soil index. Fortunately enough, we've been doing a lot of trials work, understanding how to get the best out of the product in not just high P soils, actually in more moderately balanced and low P soil indexes as well. So we've gone through a lot of the pain in terms of understanding how to get the best out of the product. Meanwhile, the market was changing in terms of its buying habits at the same time as well.
And John, what is the benefit of developing a product like Release through the Agrii R&D program?
Well, release has been generated through the Agrii R&D network, which gives us a lot of information on, as Tom says, how to use the product and get the most from it. The fact that it is applicable to land with high index where new phosphate can't be applied, to land that's getting maybe organic manures that aren't necessarily fully available, or to land where index is sufficient and growers aren't wanting to spend on phosphate as such. So it forms a good picture for ensuring the crop's getting what it's required.
So Release is described as a soil phosphorus activator. John, what does that mean in terms of how we use it?
I mean the product works on soil principally, so it isn't crop specific. If there's a situation where a crop requires available phosphate, we can turn that phosphate on, we can make it available. So at times when phosphate demand is going to be high, which would be at sowing with a spring crop or in the autumn with oilseed rape, we can manipulate the phosphate availability.
Right. And Tom, I mean, this sounds like a really interesting product. I'm sure a lot of farmers and growers will already be aware of it, but tell me a bit more about, well, how does that work? It sounds incredibly clever in terms of it activating that phosphate. So from your point of view, what does it mean?
Everything a grower does holistically to the soil, i.e. in terms of using cover crops, putting roots into the soil, plants naturally exude organic acids into the soil to unlock unavailable forms of P. That's natural biology. And if growers are doing that, and we know a lot of growers are starting to do this by putting more cover crops, we've got the SFI introducing crops, which all actually add natural organic acids to the soil that unlock unavailable forms of nutrient and make them available to the plant that's either growing or the plant that dies and gets returned to the soil. If you look at what's in the active ingredient of release, is actually ingredients that are very similar to, or actually are, plant root exudates. So actually, we're just trying to enhance what's going on in the soil anyway by this product. It's never going to release all of the P in the soil, and we actually don't want to do that, because actually our soils contain huge amounts of P. We only need a very small amount for the plant to access and grow, and once that root system is building, it's unlocking forms of P itself anyway. So we'd say release would give you about a 60-day release curve of P in the soil, or access to P, and then the equilibrium goes back to what it was before, depending on the nature of the soil, depending on how much organic matter and everything else, or how much calcium or other elements that may lock up P in the soil.
So the opportunity for the farmer here is that by using a product such as Release, it actually could reduce the need for imported materials and commodity products.
Yeah, so it can replace rock phosphate, in quite a lot of situations. I mean, across the area I work, I've got livestock farms with high indexes that can't apply new phosphate, so it works for them. I've got arable units that could do with more phosphate and are bringing in low availability organic fertilizers like manures. It can work for them to improve and enhance what's there.
You talked and hinted at a case study that you worked on. Tell us just how did that work for that arable enterprise?
So a farm, Glogan Son, up in the northeast, are a farming operation principally on heavy clay soil, and heavy clay soil with a high cation exchange is prone to phosphate lockup. So new available phosphate is generally always required. Now, there's a large bank of phosphate there. It's availability that's the problem. So we use the product in the autumn, and I sampled it every month to look at the available phosphate in soil, and we showed, compared to a control, we showed an increase in available phosphate over the winter period.
So, as is always the case here on Tramlines, we ask for your advice, your top tips for those who are listening today. John, can we start with you from that practical on-farm perspective? What would be your top tips to those who are listening today?
As ever, the more data you have, the more you can act upon it. So soil analysis is principal. Tissue analysis in season, again, is very beneficial. Grain analysis at the end can prove what has been done through the year and build upon it from there. So knowing what you're dealing with, that's the key.
Fantastic. And Tom, from your point of view, looking perhaps at a more national picture as to trends and what you feel would help farmers the most, what would be your advice and top tips to those listening?
I think one of my principal ones is grain analysis. We use the index system in terms of understanding what's in the soil, but actually, if growers are making decisions around how much P they may or may not apply, using grain testing, which is a really low cost, but actually when we look at the amount of people taking up grain testing, it's quite small, but it is a really great way of like John said, making a retrospective look back, but also you could then target your inputs around what you remove. And also, if you want to review products like Release, it's a great way of saying, well, did it actually increase that P? Did I actually increase my grain P concentrations by improving P cycling in the soil? So that the grain testing is really helpful, I think, to growers.
Well, thank you, Tom and John, for sharing your expert advice when it comes to ensuring there is sufficient phosphate availability for the growing crop. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.